Before he became the man who put America on wheels, Henry Ford was a failure. Not once, twice. 2 companies, 2 collapses, 2 rooms full of investors who watched their money disappear and swore they'd never trust him again. If you had met him in the winter of 1901, standing in the wreckage of his second bankrupt company, you would have had no reason to believe that this particular man, stubborn, awkward, obsessed with machines nobody else understood, was about to reshape the entire world. They were wrong about him. Almost everyone was. This is the story of how a farm boy who couldn't stop tinkering, who was told again and again that his ideas were impractical, turned 2 public failures into the foundation of one of the greatest industrial empires in American history. The ordinary beginning. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan, at a moment when the entire country was consumed by civil war. His world was one of horses, hand tools, and hard, unglamorous labor. His father, William, was a prosperous farmer by the standards of the time, and he wanted for his son exactly what generations of fathers before him had wanted: for the land to pass down, for the plow to stay in the family, for Henry to become, in every sense, a farmer. Young Henry hated it. Not the countryside itself, not the open air, but the repetitive, back-breaking sameness of farm labor. The same furrows, the same seasons, the same tools doing the same work they had done for 100 years, with no improvement in sight. What fascinated him instead were mechanisms. The ticking insides of a pocket watch, the hiss and clank of a steam-powered thresher passing on the road, which young Henry once chased down on foot simply to study how it moved. At the age of 12, he took apart his first watch, not to break it, but to understand it. And then, carefully, methodically, he put it back together. And it worked. Word spread through the countryside that the Ford boy had a gift, and soon neighbors were bringing him their broken clocks and watches to repair, sometimes paying him, sometimes simply grateful. That same year, Henry experienced 2 events that would shape him for the rest of his life. The first was seeing a steam engine on the road for the first time. Not on a train, but a self-propelled, portable engine used to power farm equipment. It was, in his own later recollection, the moment he realized that machines could move themselves, and that this fact would someday change everything. The second was the death of his mother, Mary Ford, which devastated him profoundly. In interviews decades later, Ford would describe the farm itself as feeling incomplete without her, the house never quite the same. In many ways, her death pushed him even further from agricultural life and deeper into the world of machines, things that, unlike people, could be understood, taken apart, diagnosed, and repaired to work exactly as intended. At 16, against his father's explicit wishes, Henry Ford walked away from the family farm and into Detroit, taking a position as a machinist's apprentice at the James F. Flower and Brothers machine shop, later moving to the Detroit Dry Dock Company. He was earning almost nothing, by his own account, barely enough to survive, and he supplemented his income at night repairing watches for extra cash. He slept in cramped boarding rooms. He worked with tools that were often unfamiliar to him and had to learn quickly or fail publicly in front of experienced machinists who had little patience for green farm boys. But for the first time in his life, he was surrounded by exactly what he loved: gears, engines, blueprints, and the promise of what mechanical ingenuity could become. He eventually returned to Dearborn for a period to help manage the family farm and to court Clara Bryant, whom he married in 1888. But farm life could never hold him permanently, and by 1891, Ford and Clara had moved to Detroit, where he took a position as an engineer with the Edison Illuminating Company. It was by any measure a good job: steady pay, respectable status, and proximity to some of the most advanced electrical technology of the era. Within a few years, he had worked his way up to chief engineer, a position of real responsibility and a comfortable, secure future for his young family, including his son Edsel, born in 1893. And yet, almost every night after his shift ended, Ford retreated to a small brick shed behind his home on Bagley Avenue, where he tinkered on something that had nothing to do with his actual job. A noisy, unpredictable little internal combustion engine mounted onto a four-wheeled frame. His neighbors considered it, at best, an eccentric hobby for a man who should have known better than to waste his evenings that way, and at worst, an outright waste of a promising engineering career. Clara, to her enormous credit, believed in him anyway, often holding a lantern so he could see his work late into the night. The impossible dream. In the early hours of June 4, 1896, after years of experimentation, Ford completed his first working vehicle, the quadricycle. It was crude by any modern standard, essentially a buggy frame with bicycle-style wheels and a small gasoline engine bolted underneath, steered with a tiller rather than a wheel. It had no reverse gear. It had no brakes to speak of. But it ran, and when Ford drove it out into the pre-dawn streets of Detroit, he had to have a worker knock down part of the brick shed wall just to get it outside, because he had built the vehicle before realizing it was wider than the doorway. When people saw it rattling down the street, some stopped in genuine wonder. Many more laughed, assuming it was a passing novelty, a rich man's toy destined to be forgotten within a year or two. The automobile, at the turn of the century, was widely dismissed by the American public as impractical, noisy, unreliable, expensive to maintain, and vastly inferior to the horse in almost every practical sense. Farmers in particular viewed it with suspicion, and Ford, a farmer's son who understood that skepticism intimately, believed something almost nobody else in his position believed: that the automobile could someday belong not to the wealthy elite who currently purchase them as showpieces, but to ordinary working families exactly like the one he grew up in. That belief would define the rest of his career. It would also very nearly destroy it, twice, before it ever paid off. In 1899, backed by William Murphy and a group of prominent Detroit investors who had seen Ford's early prototypes, Ford made the pivotal decision to leave the security of the Edison Illuminating Company and found the Detroit Automobile Company. On paper, it should have been the beginning of everything. In practice, it became his first public humiliation. Ford, a relentless perfectionist, could not stop redesigning and refining his vehicles even as the investors demanded finished products ready for sale. Where the backers saw a business that needed revenue, Ford saw machines that were not yet good enough to put his name on. The tension proved impossible to reconcile. Within roughly a year and a half, having produced only a small number of vehicles and generated almost no meaningful revenue, the Detroit Automobile Company collapsed entirely. Local newspapers took quiet notice. Within Detroit's tightly connected business circles, Ford began to acquire a reputation as an unreliable dreamer. A talented mechanic, perhaps, but not a man who could be trusted to turn ambition into a functioning, profitable business. Most men, having been humiliated once in front of the same small circle of investors who controlled the city's capital, would have taken the lesson and quietly returned to salaried engineering work. Ford did not. In November of 1901, he convinced a new set of backers, again including William Murphy, to try once more, founding the Henry Ford Company. And once again, almost as if history were repeating a cruel joke, the exact same pattern emerged. Ford wanted more time, more testing, more refinement. His financial backers, having already watched one Ford venture collapse, wanted results, and they wanted them quickly. The relationship deteriorated rapidly, and within months, the company's directors made the decision to bring in a professional consultant to oversee production and rein in Ford's perfectionism. Ford, unwilling to surrender creative control over his own machines, resigned in March of 1902, essentially pushed out of the company that bore his own name. The remaining investors reorganized the company without him. bringing in engineer Henry Leland to right the ship. Under Leland's direction, that company would go on to become one of the most prestigious automobile brands in American history, Cadillac. Read that fact again, because it is almost too ironic for fiction. The company Henry Ford built and lost became a luxury car empire under someone else's name, while Ford himself walked away for the second time in 3 years with nothing to show for it but a damaged reputation and a small circle of investors who, by now, would not have lent him a dollar. Twice bankrupt. Twice pushed out of his own company. Twice humiliated in front of the same small, gossiping fraternity of Detroit moneymen who talked to one another at dinners and clubs, who remembered names and failures with long memories, and who did not easily forgive a man who had already cost them once. By any reasonable standard of the time, Henry Ford's career in the automobile industry should have quietly ended there in the spring of 1902 as a footnote. A cautionary tale told to young engineers about the dangers of stubbornness and impractical perfectionism. The turning point. But something had shifted in Ford during those 2 collapses, something that mattered more than any single flawed transmission or delayed prototype. He had come to understand with painful clarity that his real battle was never with the engineering. It was with the structure of the business itself, with financial backers who wanted fast, incremental profit while he wanted to build something built to last, something engineered for the world he actually believed was coming. What he needed was not a third set of impatient investors to please. He needed control over his own decisions, even if it meant building that control slowly and carefully this time. To rebuild his credibility, Ford partnered with a bicycle racing mechanic and promoter named Tom Cooper to design and build a purpose-built race car, the 999, an intimidating, stripped-down machine with a massive engine and virtually no safety features. Ford himself was reportedly too frightened to drive it at full speed, and the task fell to a young, fearless cyclist named Barney Oldfield, who had never driven a car before in his life. In October of 1902, Oldfield piloted the 999 to a decisive victory over the reigning champion of American racing, and the win was covered widely in the press. It was not a business triumph, but it was something Ford desperately needed after 2 failures. Proof, publicly demonstrated, that his engineering instincts were sound. Investors who had written him off began, cautiously, to take notice again. In June of 1903, with a fresh set of backers, a group that this time included a young coal dealer named Alexander Malcolmson, and, notably, the Dodge brothers, who supplied engines and chassis, Ford founded the Ford Motor Company with just $28,000 in initial capital, a fraction of what his previous ventures had commanded. This time, Ford moved differently. He built credibility gradually, releasing the Model A, then a careful succession of increasingly refined models, B, C, F, K, N, R, S, each one teaching him more about what ordinary American buyers could actually afford and what they genuinely wanted from an automobile. He was no longer chasing mechanical perfection purely for its own sake, the way he had twice before. He was chasing a specific, almost obsessive purpose, an automobile simple and affordable enough for the American middle class. That purpose crystallized completely in October of 1908, with the introduction of the Model T. It was a car engineered not to impress wealthy buyers with luxury, but to serve the farmer, the store clerk, the rural doctor making house calls, a vehicle simple enough to be repaired with basic tools on a country roadside, and durable enough to survive roads that were, at the time, mostly unpaved dirt. Priced initially at $825 and falling steadily every year afterward as production scaled, the Model T was, in many ways, precisely the vehicle Ford had been chasing his entire adult life. And this time, with full creative control of his own company, nothing stood between him and building it exactly as he believed it should exist. Then came the decision that would not just define Ford Motor Company, but reshape industry itself, worldwide. In 1913, at his new Highland Park plant, Ford introduced the moving assembly line, inspired partly by the disassembly lines he had observed in Chicago's meatpacking plants and partly by conveyor systems used in grain processing. Instead of small teams of skilled workers building an entire vehicle from start to finish in one location, the chassis itself now moved along a conveyor, and each worker performed a single, repeated task as it passed, attaching one part, tightening one set of bolts, over and over all day. The results were almost unbelievable to contemporaries. Production time for a single Model T dropped from roughly 12.5 hours to approximately 90 minutes. As efficiency soared, prices fell dramatically, and the automobile, once dismissed as an impractical luxury for the wealthy, became, for the first time in history, something an ordinary American family could realistically save up to own. Building the legacy. In January of 1914, Ford stunned the entire business world once again, announcing a minimum wage of $5 a day for qualifying employees, more than double the prevailing industry standard, alongside a reduction of the standard workday to 8 hours. Newspapers and rival industrialists called the move reckless, even dangerous, warning it would destabilize the entire labor market. Ford understood something most of his critics did not. Workers who were paid a genuinely livable wage could, for the first time, afford to buy the very automobiles they spent their days building. He wasn't merely rewarding his workforce out of generosity. He was, quite deliberately, creating the mass consumer market his entire business model depended on. The line outside the Highland Park employment office the following morning stretched for blocks, with thousands of hopeful workers hoping to secure one of the newly lucrative positions. Turnover at Ford Motor Company, which had previously been brutally high due to the monotony of assembly line work, dropped dramatically. Productivity rose, and Ford's reputation, once tied to 2 humiliating bankruptcies, transformed almost overnight into that of a visionary industrialist, celebrated in newspapers across the country and around the world. The impact reached far beyond the walls of Ford Motor Company itself. The moving assembly line became the foundational blueprint for modern mass manufacturing across nearly every industry that followed it, from radios to refrigerators to, eventually, nearly every mass-produced consumer good of the 20th century. The automobile itself reshaped the physical geography of the United States, enabling the growth of suburbs beyond city trolley lines, demanding new paved highway systems, creating an entire national culture built around personal mobility that simply had not existed a generation earlier. Ford did not merely build cars. In very real, tangible ways, he helped build the physical and economic shape of 20th century America itself. By the early 1920s, the Model T alone accounted for roughly half of all automobiles sold in the United States, and Ford Motor Company had grown into one of the largest, most profitable industrial enterprises the world had ever seen, employing hundreds of thousands of workers across sprawling facilities, including the massive River Rouge complex. The same man who, 20 years earlier, had been quietly blacklisted by Detroit's small circle of automotive investors now sat among the most powerful and influential industrialists on the planet. Human side. But this is not and should not be told as a story of a flawless hero, and doing so would do a genuine disservice to history. Henry Ford was a deeply complicated man, and the very same stubbornness that had carried him through 2 humiliating bankruptcies later curdled into a rigid resistance to change that cost his company dearly. He clung to the aging Model T design for years after competitors, most notably General Motors under Alfred Sloan, began offering American consumers annual styling updates, financing options, and a broader range of models. Ford Motor Company's once dominant market share slipped substantially through the mid to late 1920s as a direct result of his refusal to adapt, and the company was forced into an enormously costly retooling to introduce the Model A as its replacement in 1927. His relationship with his own workforce, generous in wages, was frequently harsh and controlling in practice. Ford's internal sociological department was established nominally to help workers manage their newfound higher wages responsibly, but in reality it sent investigators into employees' homes to monitor their personal habits, spending, and even their choice of relationships as a condition of receiving the full $5 wage. As labor organizing spread across American industry through the 1930s, Ford's company responded with open hostility, most infamously during the Battle of the Overpass in May of 1937, when Ford's private security personnel violently beat United Auto Workers organizers, including a young Walter Reuther, directly in front of newspaper photographers in a confrontation that shocked much of the country and damaged Ford's public reputation considerably. Perhaps most troubling of all, Ford used his own newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which he owned and funded, to publish a sustained series of antisemitic articles throughout the early 1920s, later compiled and distributed internationally as pamphlets under the title The International Jew. This is a permanent and deeply shameful stain on his legacy, one that cannot and should not be separated from the story of his engineering achievements, and one that his own family and historians alike would later acknowledge as a profound moral failure with real, documented harm, including its later use as propaganda material by the Nazi regime in Germany. Facing mounting public pressure and the serious threat of a defamation lawsuit, Ford issued a public apology in 1927 and ceased publication of the newspaper, though the damage done, both to his own reputation and, far more importantly, to the people directly targeted by that hatred, could never be fully undone. To tell Henry Ford's story honestly requires holding both of these truths at once, without letting either one erase the other. A man whose engineering vision and business decisions genuinely reshaped the modern industrial world for the better, and a man whose personal failings caused real, lasting harm that deserves to be remembered alongside his achievements, not quietly omitted from them. Emotional ending. Strip away the empire, the assembly lines, the billions of dollars, the sprawling factories along the Rouge River, and what remains at the core is a simpler and more human story. A farm boy who was told repeatedly and by people who genuinely believed they were right that his ideas were impractical. A man who lost everything, twice, in the same industry, in the same city, in front of the very same skeptical investors who had already decided he could not be trusted, and who, against every reasonable expectation, tried again anyway. Henry Ford's real innovation was never the automobile itself. Automobiles, in various crude forms, already existed before he ever built his first quadricycle in that Bagley Avenue shed. His real innovation was refusing to accept that two very public failures meant the dream itself was finished. He treated each collapse not as a verdict on his worth, but as information, hard, painful, necessary information about exactly what needed to change before the next attempt could succeed. That, perhaps, is the most honest lesson buried inside his story. Not that success is somehow guaranteed to anyone persistent enough to chase it, and not that failure should be romanticized or treated lightly, but that the distance between a twice bankrupt, blacklisted mechanic standing in a collapsed company in the spring of 1902 and one of the most consequential industrialists in American history was not talent alone, and was certainly not luck alone. It was a decision, made twice, in rooms full of people who had already stopped believing in him, to stand back up and try one more time.